An affair to remember. I first laid eyes on Jake at the gym. It wasn't just a glance, it was like a jolt, a pull that shot straight through me and planted itself deep in my core. I was 64, married for over 4 decades, but to a man who had long ceased to be my romantic partner. Richard was a good man in so many ways, but our marriage had withered like an old oak tree, reduced to a routine of cordial indifference. We were like 2 parallel lines, existing side by side, but never really connecting. But Jake was different. He was a breath of fresh, intoxicating air. I remember that day at the gym clearly, the way Jake moved with an effortless grace, his youthful energy a sharp contrast to my own weariness. Jake was just 22 years old, young and vigorous, and his presence felt almost magnetic. He had an intensity in his eyes, a fire that was impossible to ignore. I found myself drawn to him in a way I hadn't experienced in years, a kind of yearning that stirred something deep inside me. I'd catch myself watching him from across the room, feeling a mix of excitement and guilt, a dangerous dance of forbidden desires. I knew that what I was feeling was wrong, but oh, it was also thrilling. I was determined to get his attention. The first time I approached him, it was casual, a simple comment about how well he was lifting weights. But it was the way I said it, the light touch on his arm that was meant to convey more than mere friendliness. Jake was polite, smiling as he replied, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something I took as curiosity, or perhaps even interest. Over the next few weeks, I became more deliberate. I'd change into workout clothes that accentuated my figure, subtle but revealing enough to be provocative. I'd often find reasons to be near him, striking up conversations and gently touching his arm or shoulder during our exchanges. I'd watch his reaction closely, noticing the way he'd stiffen or try to maintain his composure. It was a game, and one I was both excited and apprehensive about playing. Despite my efforts, Jake was elusive. He was always polite, always engaging, but never crossing the line. He would laugh at my jokes, but there was a noticeable distance that kept me guessing. His responses were measured, never encouraging, yet not dismissive either. It was as though he was playing a game of restraint, and the more he held back, the more I wanted to push the boundaries. I'd find myself daydreaming about him, imagining scenarios where he'd finally give in. I started to crave our encounters, looking forward to seeing him at the gym, waiting for that brief but charged interaction. Each day, my anticipation grew, fueling my desire. One day, after an intense workout, I decided to take a different approach. I had just finished my session and was wiping off sweat when Jake approached. I was wearing a form-fitting tank top and shorts, the material clinging to me in a way I hoped would catch his eye. I could see him glancing at me as he approached, a smirk playing on his lips. "Hey, Jake," I said, trying to sound casual, but feeling the undercurrent of tension between us. "You've been working hard. How about a smoothie after this?" He looked at me with that same unreadable expression, but I saw a spark of something in his eyes. "Sure," he said. "That sounds good." His voice was steady. We went to the smoothie bar together, and the conversation was light, filled with the usual banter. But I could sense a shift. There was an edge to his responses, a slight change in his demeanor. I decided to test the waters further. As we stood close to each other, I let my hand brush against his, my fingers lingering for a moment longer than necessary. He didn't pull away, but his gaze was fixed on the counter, his face a mask of concentration. The real breakthrough came a few days later. I had invited Jake to my house for dinner, under the pretense of getting to know him better. Richard was away on one of his frequent business trips, leaving me alone to plan an evening that I hoped would be both memorable and revealing. I spent hours preparing the meal, dressing in a soft, elegant dress that I knew would highlight my curves. When Jake arrived, he looked surprised, but pleased. We sat down to a sumptuous dinner, and the atmosphere was filled with warmth and a hint of something more. We were like 2 fireflies, irresistibly drawn to each other, our light becoming more and more intense. I'd catch myself watching him from across the room, feeling a strange mix of longing and excitement, a dangerous dance of forbidden desires. I watched him as he spoke, his mouth moving, his teeth flashing, a perfect contrast against the redness of his lips. My body felt alive, awakened in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I yearned for him, the taste of him, the feel of him against my skin. The conversation flowed easily, but it was just the surface of what was really happening. A subtle game of give and take between two bodies that wanted nothing more than to be together. The air hung thick with unspoken words and veiled glances. I caught him looking at me, and a delicious shiver of anticipation ran down my spine. I could almost taste him, the wild, intoxicating blend of youth and temptation that Jake represented. I craved him, each stolen glance, each accidental touch setting off an explosion in my core. I knew that what was happening was wrong. It was a dangerous game I was playing, but oh, how thrilling the risk was. I reached out a hand and brushed his arm. The skin was smooth beneath my fingers, and the moment lingered. I felt him stiffen, his eyes darkening with a desire that mirrored my own. It was like two magnets drawn together. My touch was meant to convey more than simple friendship, an invitation into a world where time, logic, and morality had no place. The conversation flowed easily, but there was an undertone of a wild dance, the anticipation a drug. I would watch the way his eyes lingered on me. I'd catch his gaze on me. I wanted to touch him. To run my fingers through his hair. I wanted to feel his lips on mine. I wanted to lose myself completely. As we ate, I'd allow my gaze to wander over his body, taking in every detail. His strong shoulders, his powerful hands, and the way his shirt stretched across his chest. My heart beat hard. I was lost in this dance, and I couldn't help but want to see where it took me. We moved to the living room, where I had arranged things to be cozy and intimate. The soft lighting and comfortable seating created a perfect haven for our growing desires. We were like two fireflies, irresistibly drawn to each other, our light becoming more and more intense. We sat on the couch, close enough that our legs were touching, and I poured us both glasses of wine. I felt his gaze on me, warm and consuming. Every touch sent a jolt of electricity through me, a thrilling promise of what was to come. I felt like I had been reborn, alive and open to pleasure once again. It was like we had entered a different realm, a world where desire was the only rule and the anticipation was intoxicating. I wanted to see where this dangerous dance would lead, to break the rules and experience something wild and free. My hand brushed against his, my fingers lingering on his arm for just a moment longer than necessary. I caught his gaze. It was like two magnets drawn together, and I knew that we were both waiting, breath held, for what would happen next. He would laugh at my jokes, but there was a noticeable distance, an unspoken tension that had me guessing. His responses were measured, never fully encouraging, but never dismissive either. It was a game of control and desire, and the more he held back, the more I wanted to push the boundaries. I'd catch him glancing at my figure, his eyes lingering on my curves with a hunger I could feel all the way down to my toes. I'd catch myself doing the same, my eyes tracing the lines of his body, each stolen glance a delicious taste of the forbidden fruit. When I reached for my wine, I brushed my fingers against his arm, just a fleeting touch that lingered far too long to be accidental. I watched his reaction, a quick intake of breath, his eyes darkening with desire. He stiffened slightly, struggling to maintain the composure he usually seemed to possess. I felt a thrill as I realized what I could do, a power that flowed between us. As the night wore on, we'd catch each other's gaze, and it was like a spark would fly between us. I knew it was wrong. I knew the danger I was playing with. And yet, a dangerous thrill drove me on. Every touch, every brush of skin was a tantalizing promise of what we both wanted. Our conversation became more personal, more intense. As I spoke, I would watch the way his eyes would linger on my lips. I craved that intensity. I craved his touch. I needed to feel his mouth on mine. I needed him. It became a game of subtle touches, a light brush of my shoulder against his, a hand reaching out to hold his for just a moment too long. These small acts were almost more intoxicating than a kiss. A silent and dangerous language between us. He'd stiffen as he would try to maintain his calm demeanor, but I could feel the way my touch seemed to ignite a fire inside of him, and the dangerous thrill of it was undeniable. I could feel him fight his restraint, and it only seemed to ignite a fire inside me. I found myself thinking of him, dreaming of him, every moment we were apart. The anticipation before we met was intoxicating, a rush of excitement that coursed through me at the possibility of seeing him once again. He would laugh, and his eyes would linger on my lips, a silent promise that would make me shiver with anticipation. I wanted more. I wanted him to lose control. And I knew that it was only a matter of time. The lines between right and wrong were beginning to blur, and I was losing myself in the thrill of the forbidden. The boundaries that I had known all of my life were being tested, and I felt as though my desire had taken a hold of me and would not be denied. I'd catch him glancing at my figure, his eyes lingering on my curves with a hunger I could feel all the way down to my toes. I'd catch myself doing the same, my eyes tracing the lines of his body, each stolen glance a delicious taste of the forbidden fruit. He was like a drug, a delicious addiction that I craved more and more with each passing day. I couldn't imagine my life without him now. The spark that he had brought into my world had given it a life that I had never known. We continued on like this, until one day, my body thrummed with a longing I had never known existed, and I needed to be close to him. I needed to know if he felt it too. I had invited him to my home, a dangerous game that would either ignite a fire between us or burn everything to the ground. The anticipation before he arrived was almost too much to bear. I was both excited and scared. I couldn't wait to see him, to touch him, to feel his gaze on my skin once again. I had changed into a soft, elegant dress, choosing something that hugged my curves perfectly. The dress was a dangerous weapon, I knew, and I wanted to see if he would respond to my silent invitation. I wanted to test his restraint, and I knew that it was likely that we would both lose. When he arrived, it was like the air crackled. I could feel a spark between us, a tension that was both electrifying and dangerous. We moved into the living room, the mood intimate and the air filled with unspoken desire. I poured us both glasses of wine and we settled on the couch, our bodies almost touching. I could feel his gaze on me, warm and consuming. I felt myself tremble at the intensity of it, my skin aching for his touch. It was as though he had come to ignite all that I had kept hidden away for so long. Our conversation was a mere pretense. Beneath the surface, there was a current, an unspoken language between two bodies that were begging to be connected. He reached for my hand, the touch electrifying, sending jolts through me that tingled all the way down to my toes. He laughed, and that caused the spark in his eyes to ignite the fire in my soul. And when he looked at me, there was something in his eyes I had not seen before, a challenge to the dance we had been playing, a demand for something that we had both been holding back for far too long. I'd often catch his gaze on my figure, lingering on my curves with a hunger I could feel all the way to my toes. I was drawn to him, a moth to a flame, a dangerous game we were playing with no regard for what we might be burning down around us. I was consumed by desire, and I knew that what would follow was inevitable. The music, the conversation, the world around us began to fade. All I saw was his dark gaze, the fire in his eyes, and the heat that was pouring off of his body. I had to know how far we could go. That night, Jake was different. He was magnetic, like a wildfire, his energy intoxicating. Our conversations flowed easily, but there was an undercurrent, a silent conversation between two bodies aching for release. I remember a moment when his hand brushed against mine, my skin tensing beneath the contact. It was a small touch, but it sent a jolt through me, a silent promise that had me yearning for more. I let my eyes drift over his body, taking in every detail, the way his muscles moved beneath his clothes, his mouth so sensuous when he smiled. He was like a drug, and I was addicted, wanting more of this dangerous dance between us. It was a game we were playing, a game of wanting and needing and daring to reach for what we were both trying to deny ourselves. I could feel his body tremble at my touch, and the awareness of that dangerous control was intoxicating. His gaze would linger a little too long on my lips, his hand brushing against mine as I passed him his drink, the heat between us building with every glance, every brush of our skin. It was a silent language we had created, and I knew it was only a matter of time before we lost ourselves completely. I found myself increasingly consumed by him, by his touch, by his presence in my life, the desire that was a constant companion within me. We moved closer, almost touching as we sat on the couch. His voice had dropped, a husky whisper that made my skin tingle with desire. My hand had found its way into his hair, the silky texture making my heart beat hard against my chest. I felt the moment slipping away. I wanted more. My breath grew ragged as I leaned in, allowing our lips to meet, a spark igniting a wildfire of passion that would not be denied. The kiss was a revelation, both tender and filled with urgency. It was like all the longing, all the pent-up anticipation of the past few weeks was pouring out of us, and I found myself consumed by it. His hands framed my face, his fingers caressing my skin, and I knew that there would be no going back from here. We became lost in each other, exploring with a mixture of fire and longing, a dangerous dance between two hearts that ached to be connected. He deepened the kiss, and his tongue made its way into my mouth, and I gasped at the intensity. The connection was both physical and emotional, a culmination of everything that had been building between us. It was a new form of pleasure, an explosion of my senses, my inhibitions falling away as my desire took over. After our moment, we lay together, breathless, the room filled with the soft sounds of our breathing. He looked at me, a mix of desire and longing in his eyes. "I never knew it could be like this," he said, and I smiled, my heart full. I had never experienced anything like it. Neither did I, but it's been incredible. The dangerous game that we had started was now a blazing wildfire. The tension between us had finally broken, and I knew that our relationship would never be the same again. We had crossed the line, and there was no turning back. But it was the way I said it, the light touch on his arm that was meant to convey more than mere friendliness. We became a fire, burning all in our path, careless of what we destroyed and completely lost in the heat of it all. It was a dangerous dance, and yet I couldn't bring myself to turn away. Our encounters became an intoxicating mix of passion and secrecy, each touch, each glance filled with a meaning that was only shared between us. He was no longer just the young man at the gym. He had become someone I cared deeply about, and that was dangerous too. As time went on, our conversations went deeper, touching on fears, dreams, and the complexities of our lives. He began to push me, ask questions that were more intimate. I would feel his gaze on my lips, and my breath would catch with the anticipation of what I knew he was going to do. His touches became more confident, more daring, and I found myself wanting more. It was like he had seen a fire inside of me and had come to ignite it to its fullest extent. Our desires pulled us together as we danced on the edge. He was my secret, my delicious secret, and the thought of him filled me with both excitement and dread. I knew I was playing a dangerous game, but I felt as if it was a risk I was willing to take. The desire was too strong to ignore. We were like two lost souls, drawn together by an irresistible force. We became addicted to each other, caught in a whirlwind of stolen glances and dangerous touches. The heat between us was undeniable, like a fire that threatened to consume us both. One evening, after a particularly intense conversation, Jake took my hand and led me to a quiet, secluded spot in the garden. The soft moonlight bathed us in a gentle glow. It was the perfect setting for the inevitable, for the moment I had been both craving and dreading. "Marie," he began, his voice serious, "I've been thinking a lot about us, about what we want, and what this means. I care about you deeply, but I can't keep going like this. It's tearing me apart, and I know it's affecting you too." I looked at him, feeling a mix of sadness and longing. "I know," I replied. I knew that he was going to say goodbye, that our dangerous dance was about to come to an end. His gaze was so intense, so raw, and I knew there was going to be no way that I could look at anyone the same after him. I was lost in his intensity. The desire between us was so strong that the thought of not having it was like losing a part of me that I had never known existed. He had awakened a part of me that had long since been asleep, and I was afraid of what the waking world held. He had ignited a fire within me, and now it seemed he was going to put it out, and the thought of that almost broke me. "I've been thinking about it too," I said, my voice soft, afraid of what I was about to lose. I never imagined it would get to this point. I confessed. I felt as though I had been caught in a storm and it had left me gasping for breath. I was just looking for something different, something that made me feel alive. He took my hands in his touch sending a shiver of longing down my spine. He looked at me with an intensity that made my knees weak. He was my secret pleasure, my addiction. It was a dangerous game, but I could not bring myself to stop. It was as though he was trying to touch my soul, and I found myself wanting more, wanting to fall completely into this new world, a world where our passions collided. I had never felt so alive, so completely consumed, and now he was going to take it all away. We were like two magnets, pulled together by a force that was beyond our control. I didn't know how much longer we could continue on and still feel anything. He took a deep breath, his eyes searching mine. "I want to be with you, Marie. I want us to have a future together. But we need to figure out how to make that happen." He had just given voice to all that I desired, but it was tinged with a sense of fear that had me holding my breath. It's not fair to either of us to keep living in this limbo. A part of me wanted to fall into his arms, but a part of me was afraid. The rules had changed, the game had ended, and I was suddenly face to face with the choices that I had made. And the one that I knew was coming. "I know," my voice caught, a tear starting to slide down my face as I spoke. "But how do we do that?" It was a question that was filled with longing and uncertainty. "I just wanted to feel something again," I whispered as I looked away from him, afraid of what would come next. Afraid of where this would lead. He was everything, my dangerous addiction, and I was not ready to lose him. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of unspoken desires and forbidden truths. That night, Jake stayed over at my place, and after we had shared dinner and drinks, we lay together and made love in my bed. His touch was like a spark, and the fire that had been smoldering between us was now fully ablaze, consuming us both with an intensity that was both exhilarating and frightening. He had brought me back to life, had made me crave his touch, his gaze, everything about him. And now, I had to wonder what it all meant. What would we do now? Where would we go from here? After we made love, we lay together, the room filled with the soft sounds of our breathing. Jake looked at me, his eyes dark with passion and a hint of concern. "I never knew it could be like this," he said softly. I smiled, my heart full. Neither did I. My voice was a breath of air, barely audible, the moment between us heavy with the weight of unspoken promises and dangerous yearnings. But it's been incredible. We knew that things could never go on as they had, living in our secret world. Our clandestine meetings were exciting but exhausting, and the weight of our deception became harder and harder to carry. The thrill of the affair never waned, and Jake's youthful exuberance contrasted sharply with the stagnant routine of my married life. Yet, the guilt was always there, a shadow that followed me everywhere. We continued to meet, each touch and glance loaded with secret promises and forbidden truths. It was like we were two star-crossed lovers, destined to be with each other, and yet bound by circumstances that held us apart. The tension became a drug, our connection the only way we could truly feel alive. But still, I knew the danger that I was dancing with and the risk that came with every breath I took. One evening, Jake took my hand and led me to a secluded spot in the garden. The the soft moonlight bathing us in a gentle glow. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. "Marie," he said, his voice low and serious, "I've been thinking a lot about us, about what we want and what this means." I felt a pang of dread, but I couldn't look away from the fire in his gaze. "I care about you deeply," Jake admitted, his eyes piercing mine. "But I can't keep going like this. It's tearing me apart, and I know it's affecting you too." He reached up and brushed my cheek, the touch both gentle and full of promise. I closed my eyes, as if trying to block out what I knew was going to come next. "I want a future with you, Marie, but we need to figure out how to make that happen. It's not fair to either of us to keep living in this limbo." His words hung in the air between us, a dangerous mix of want and despair, and I knew that what was coming would break me. "I know," I admitted softly. He asked me what I wanted, not just in our relationship, but in my life. His question hit me hard. I was so consumed by the thrill of the secret, the excitement of desire, I had not truly considered the long-term implications. I confessed to him what I wanted: a life of passion, a love that knew no bounds, a life that was truly mine. He listened, his eyes burning holes in my soul, his touch sending shivers down my spine. He understood. My heart was being ripped in two by this beautiful broken man and the life I had spent so long creating. I had to make a choice, and it was becoming more apparent with each passing minute that it would change everything. Richard's return was a cold dose of reality. He had come home earlier than expected, and the fear of being discovered had been a jolt. I had quickly ended the call, my heart racing as I faced him. He looked at me with confusion, his brows furrowed, and his eyes holding the questions that hung between us. "Everything all right?" he asked, the words causing a wave of guilt to wash over me. I was so used to his blank gaze that the curiosity in his eyes made me want to run away, to hide myself where no one could see the truth that I had become. I forced a smile, trying to appear nonchalant. "Yes, just had a long day. I was talking to a friend," I said quickly. He seemed satisfied by my answer, but the truth was there, a spark in his gaze, a flicker of knowing that I knew in my heart was there. I watched him as he moved away from me, and I could not help but feel the weight of what we had both lost so long ago. The emotional weight of this double life became harder to bear. We continued to meet in secret, but the thrill was becoming tainted with a sense of wrong, and I found myself wrestling with my conscience. And that night, Jake took my hand and led me to a small spot in the garden. There in the moonlight, our eyes met and I knew the truth in the depths of my heart. I had to make a choice. I couldn't continue on the path I had been on, leading two lives and lying to my husband. "Marie," Jake began, his voice low, "I've been thinking a lot about us, and about what we want, about where we want to go." "I know," I replied, a sigh escaping my lips at what was to come. "I've been thinking about it too." "I never imagined it would get to this point," I added, and my heart ached at the words. "I care about you deeply," he said, "but I can't keep going like this. It's tearing me apart, and I know it's affecting you too." I allowed his words to hang in the air between us, feeling their weight and the truth of them. He reached up and caressed my face with such tender hands that I felt my resolve begin to break. He was a drug, an addiction that I wanted to surrender to fully. "I know," I confessed again, my voice soft with regret. It had been inevitable that we would reach this point, and I was not sure how I was going to survive the choice I was about to make. I was still looking for a way to deny the desire that was aflame inside of me. The love that had started as a secret indulgence had become something I could no longer live without. The fear of loss was a monster, and it was threatening to rip me apart. Jake was like a drug, and like a drug, I knew he could destroy me if I let him. I felt like a moth drawn to a flame, knowing that I was going to get burned, and yet I could not help but to reach out to him. I wanted him. I craved him. My heart beat fast as he began to speak, and every fiber of my being was focused on him. I knew that I was playing a game with danger, but I had fallen, and now I would have to find my own way out. "I want to be with you, Marie." His words were filled with a deep-seated truth that caused my heart to ache. "I want us to have a future together, but we need to figure out how to make that happen. It's not fair to either of us to keep living in this limbo." My marriage had been a comfortable place, one of stability and routine, and yet my soul had yearned for more, for passion, for excitement, for Jake. My head was telling me that this was madness, that I should go back to the life that I had so long ago built for myself, and yet my heart, body, and soul told me that I had to keep reaching towards the spark that Jake had brought to me. That night, as the moonlight washed over us, I told him my truth, and he told me his. I confessed all that I had been yearning for. He acknowledged the danger and the consequences of our desires. But still, we had to be together. There was no going back. I felt a sense of panic as I considered the repercussions of what I wanted. Was I going to destroy everything to have this man in my life? Was it worth it? Was what I felt real? Or was it merely the thrill of the forbidden? Richard was a good man, but our marriage had lost its spark long ago. Jake offered a new beginning, a chance to rediscover passion and connection, but leaving Richard was not something I could do lightly. As the days went by, I found myself increasingly torn between the excitement of my relationship with Jake and the reality of my marriage. Richard remained oblivious to the secret life I was leading. But I was beginning to be torn apart by the lies and the deceit. I knew that this dangerous dance could not continue much longer. I would have to make a choice. After many sleepless nights, I knew that I was at a crossroads. I needed to make a decision. I had to choose what I wanted and make it a reality. It was terrifying, but I had to confront it, no matter what the cost. I had to end my marriage. It was a choice that was difficult but necessary. It was painful, filled with doubt and regret. Richard was devastated, but he understood that our marriage had reached its end. Jake and I began a new chapter, building our relationship on a foundation of honesty and shared experiences. The transition was challenging, but we faced it together. What began as a secret indulgence had become the basis for a new beginning, one that was filled with both promise and uncertainty. Yet still, I was plagued by the guilt. Every night, as I laid my head on the pillow, I was haunted by the knowledge that Richard had no idea the truth of who I was and what I had done. I knew that it was an act of deception that would stay with me forever. I knew this path was full of obstacles, but I also felt the thrill of something more, the possibility of a love that was real. The passion between us burned, a beacon in the night, offering hope for something that I had never thought I would find. The thrill of our clandestine meetings, the way his body responded to mine, all of it was intoxicating, and I didn't know if I was strong enough to walk away. I had allowed myself to feel again, and it was like a floodgate had been opened. His dark gaze seemed to reach into my soul. His hands on my skin were like a fire, igniting a longing deep inside me. I wanted to lose myself completely in him, to abandon everything I had ever known for the chance of something real. And with all of that came fear, and the knowledge that I was risking everything. Jake had brought a whirlwind of passion into my life, and while that was intoxicating, I knew it was not going to be enough. I knew that this had to end. I had to face the reality of the life that I had made for myself and be honest about what I truly wanted. The passion was a drug, and I craved more. The touch of his lips, the warmth of his skin against mine, a reminder of everything I had been missing. And yet, I felt as though I was walking a tightrope. One wrong move, and I would lose it all. Jake's assertiveness grew, as did his emotional investment. He was no longer just my secret lover. He was becoming someone I deeply cared about. I loved his boldness, the fire that I saw in his eyes when we were together, the fact that he pushed me to be more than what I had become. I watched him, feeling a mix of wonder and longing, and I had to wonder if what I felt was real or simply a mirage of something I had yearned for. I wanted to surrender myself completely to Jake. And yet, the love that had grown between us had blossomed like a dangerous flower. and the thorns of it threatened to prick us at every turn. One evening, Jake took my hand and led me to a secluded place in the park. I knew that what would follow would change everything. He was quiet, pensive, his eyes full of a storm that was building inside of him. "Marie, I've been thinking a lot about us," he began, his voice so low it was a breath against my skin. "About what we want and what this all means."
My heart was thumping hard against my chest, both terrified and excited at the promise of those words. I knew that this conversation would lead us to an answer, and that nothing would ever be the same. He confessed that he loved me, that he wanted a future with me, that he knew we couldn't continue in secret any longer. I agreed, my voice trembling as I did so. I wanted it all, but I was terrified of the changes that would be required. "What are we doing, Marie?" he asked, and the fear in his voice seemed to reach deep inside of me. He was afraid too. "I know this is intense," I admitted softly, "and I can see how much it means to you. But where is this going? What do you want?" He was my weakness, and I was terrified to ask the questions that lingered in the air between us, knowing that what we had was as fragile as it was fierce. "I want to be with you, Marie." He said the words as though he was giving me a promise. "I want us to have a future together, but we need to figure out how to make that happen. It's not fair to either of us to keep living." I looked away from him, the truth of what he said piercing me like a dagger. I knew that it was true. I had wanted this excitement, this passion, and now I had. Was it worth destroying the life that I had built? Was it? Neither did I. But it's been incredible. He had laid his heart bare to me, and now I confessed all that I had been thinking, the fear and the passion, the secret desire. That night, after a long discussion, Jake and I held each other in a soft embrace. We both knew that things had to change, we had to make a choice, and it was one that was both thrilling. In the end, our relationship was a testament to the power of passion and the complexity of human connections. It was a journey of self-discovery and transformation, one that brought both joy. The passion we shared was both physical and emotional. It was like a fire, consuming us both completely, and it was as thrilling as. And yet, as the affair continued, I knew I had to make a choice. And it was one that was both terrifying. Richard was oblivious to the double life that I was leading, but the guilt and fear were beginning to take their toll, and I knew it. It was like living on a tightrope, and the fall to either side. One evening, Richard came home early from a business trip. He could feel the tension that surrounded us. He looked at me. "Everything all right?" His voice was filled with a strange mixture of concern and something else. Something that made my heart beat out of my chest. Yes, just had a long day. I knew it.